Chinese hi-fi, or chi-fi, has been making big splashes in the world of earphones for the past 5 years or so. Gone are the days when people lusted over Shure, Sennheiser, and Westone, and instead the spotlight has shifted to the vast sea of cheap earphones from Chinese brands. It was simple back then. The only brand that was really popular was VSonic, but if you were willing to splurge, you could go for things from Danu, Aureolus, QDC, Unique Melody, etc. Fast forward to around 2017 and all of a sudden, everyone and their mom were hyping up models after models from brands that I had never heard of before. KZ, LZ, TRN, TFZ, BYZ, BGVP, VJJB, DZ80, DQ, SMDQ, EYZ. Honestly, what's up with these names? Like, Jesus Christ, man, chill with the consonants. And isn't LZ a file format? Why not just go with a more normal name like Moondrop? See, that's a perfectly elegant name right there. Of the many names of gibberish piles of letters that are seemingly copied from encrypted files, one name started to gain a lot of attention around 2019, and that is TinHifi. Today, I have the T4 dynamic driver earphone, and as someone who dabbles a lot with mid-range earphones from well-known Western and Japanese brands, I'm going to tell you my experience with my first chi-fi earphone with a true chi-fi price tag. This is Earphoneus Fanaticus, and let me present to you my detailed review of the TinHifi T4 earphone. As usual, I'll start with physical design, but if you are more interested in other aspects, feel free to check out the timestamps in the description down below. The earpiece is silver all around, and it is made of natural aluminium, whatever that means. The fact that it's made of aluminium is probably the reason why the earpieces are so light. Comparing to the chunky JVC FDX1, they really are in different weight classes. In terms of shape, it looks like a shrunken metal cylinder with a nozzle. This is of course just a convoluted way of saying that the earpieces are not all that form-fitting. Now, I can't say it's uncomfortable to wear, but I wouldn't say it feels amazing to wear either. There's a lot of empty space in the outer ear that is not occupied by the earpiece, so isolation must come solely from the ear tip without the casing physically blocking noises. And the fact that there's so much empty space means that you will never get the same fit. I have to confess, at first, this was the least comfortable earphone I've ever used because it only took 10 seconds for irritation to kick in. But after a lot of trial and error, I finally found the best way to wear the earphone, but even then I can't have it too deep into my ears. The finicky fit also means you never get the same exact sound each time you put on the earphone. On the back there's this sunburst pattern which can look quite attractive under the right light. What isn't so attractive, however, is the MMCX socket. MMCX always gets bad raps for being loose and not as durable as 2-pin, but personally, I never had any issues with it. That is, until I bent the T4. Look at how effortlessly the earpiece rotates around the cable. This is a big problem because if your cable doesn't have any sort of ear guide, it will just fall from your ears over and over again, which is super annoying, especially when you're on the go. And check this out. Do you see this ridiculous amount of wiggle? This is why no matter how many cables I tried, the earphone still cuts out very easily, with the chance of this happening ranging from sometimes to very often. This isn't some long-term wear and tear that leads to bad connection, it came like this. For some reason, the stock cable does the worst in this regard, and it got so bad that I decided to just use my own cable instead of the stock one for the sound analysis later in this review. Can't get a good grasp of how good the earphone sounds when it cuts out every time with the slightest head movement, but even changing the cable doesn't completely resolve the problem because the right side still cuts out when the earpiece is too deep into my ear. I guess this is just the kind of quality control you should expect out of Chinese brands, and I must remind everyone that my Shure SE215, which is even cheaper than the T4, has no issue at all with its MMCX socket. Let's talk about the cable. I like how it looks. It's a knit cable that's lightweight and adequately flexible, so using this on the go should be no problem, assuming your T4 doesn't have bad connection like mine. It's silvery all around, so it reminds me a lot of those exotic audiophile cables. On Linso, which is probably the easiest website for finding all sorts of chi-fi earphones, they do have some description regarding the cable, but I don't really know what material is used for the metal wires. I would assume it's copper, because copper is almost as good as silver in terms of having low resistivity, and it's a lot cheaper. The cable uses heat-molded ear guide, which somehow is able to achieve better evenness and curvature than Massdrop's cable with its Plus earphone. Made in America, am I right, guys? The choker is a transparent plastic orb that fits the colorway of the cable and is very easy to use. It slides smoothly against the TPU coating of the cable and is able to hold the position of the split pretty well. Massdrop should once again take notes. The Y split and the 3.5mm audio plug are both very lightweight, so my guess is that they are made of natural aluminum as well. Simple is beautiful, and these bits on the cable are just that. There is, however, a huge problem with it that completely discourages me from using it, and that is if I plug this into a device that's charging, say a smartphone, I can hear electrical noises coming through in the frequency of G. And when I start playing music, I can even feel the cable literally shocking my ears, especially at the helix or here. That's where the MMCX socket is, so I have to assume that's a problem with electrical insulation. To ensure the cable is really the culprit rather than the earpiece, I connected the cable to my Onkyo E900M and, yep, same electrical sound, same pain from getting shocked. Going back to the T4, if I connect it to any other cables, I don't have any issues at all. So yeah, the cable is definitely the problem. Audiophiles like to describe sounds with as many adjectives as possible, and instead of saying an earphone is exciting, they might say it's electrifying. But this time I'm afraid TinHifi might have taken that too far. Let's briefly touch on technical specs. It's a single driver design with a carbon nanotube driver that measures at 10mm in diameter. There's practically no information on why carbon nanotube is used, and I don't have any way to verify that it's the exact material that's used to make the driver. Isn't it expensive to make as well? How in the world did TinHifi shove such expensive material into a cheap earphone like this? Honestly, they could have used plastic to make the driver for all I care. I'm only interested in how the driver performs. With a frequency range of 10Hz to 20kHz, the T4 is not a high-res earphone, but nobody should care about that. Looking at impedance, the figure provided is 32 ohms, which is par for the course for earphones. The T4 uses dynamic drivers, so I don't think you have to worry too much about impedance matching. Sensitivity, on the other hand, is a bit too complicated for me to interpret. The figure TinHifi provides is 102 decibels at 1kHz V 0.126 V. I understand that sensitivity measurement is always taken at 1kHz, but what's confusing is that I don't actually know what unit they're using. The common units are typically either dB per volt or dB per milliwatt. These two units can be converted between one another if you know the impedance. TinHifi, on the other hand, doesn't seem to use either of them, so I can't really fit this data into the graph. When searching on Google, this Amazon page says it's 105 dB per milliwatt, while others just take TinHifi's 102 figure and add dB per milliwatt after it. Now, some of you out there who are more knowledgeable than me can probably convert TinHifi's figure to the more common units, but that's of course assuming TinHifi themselves are providing the correct number. Take the T2 earphone as an example. On Linso, the earphone sensitivity is rated at 102 dB per milliwatt, but this report from RAA shows 111.56 dB per milliwatt instead. So either RAA is bullshitting or TinHifi doesn't know how to measure their own earphones. I have not a single clue. I can't say, however, that comparing to the K3003, the T4 is only a hair softer in volume, while the T4 itself is a little bit louder than the EX1000. So if I have to guess, I would say it's around 109 dB per milliwatt. In any case, I think the earphone is very easy to drive, and you should have no trouble using it with smartphones, DAPs, desktop, laptops, etc. Let's check out the accessories. The earphone comes with a pair of foam tips and two sets of silicone tips. I actually really like the foam tips. They feel quite supple and don't expand immediately after squishing. They are, however, quite bulky, so not everyone would want to use these. I also noticed that one of the tips is actually taller by 1mm. It doesn't sound like a big difference, right? Well, we are talking about ear tips here, so everything from shape, length, diameter of the opening, material to insertion depth can all affect how an earphone sounds. But in any case, I'll tell you how these tips perform later on. The two sets of silicone tips that also come with the T4 have the same dimensions, so the only difference between them is just their colorways. Speaking of colorways, at first I thought TinHifi was generous enough to include SpinFit with such a cheap pair of earphones, but it turns out they are just fakes that look really similar to the CP100. Flipping the flange up reveals no spinny bit between the tube and the flange, and the same thing goes for the black tips as well. Not really sure why they would copy SpinFit. Oh wait, TinHifi is a Chinese brand. Copying is what Chinese brands do best. How could I forget, seeing that I'm also a Chinese myself? I, of all people, should know better than to question why Chinese brands are copying the others. Rather, the question should have always been, why wouldn't they? Plagiarism, paying homage, is just what they do. Now, speaking of paying homage, I can't help but think the shape of this earphone reminds me of an earphone from another brand, and after some searching I found exactly what I had in mind, the Sony IER-Z1R. Look at them. Obviously, Sony paid homage to TinHifi with that one. Good job, guys. That's some strong recognition from another brand right there. China, you the best. See, shit like this along with poor QC is exactly why Chinese stuff is so fucking hated. There's absolutely no way they can't do better than this. Look at the foam tips. No copying, just properly designed if we could be so generous as to ignore their mismatching heights. Let's not forget that. Well, actually, I don't even think TinHifi designed these. They probably just sourced them from somewhere else because I have the same exact model of tips from buying a Unique Melody earphone in 2016. Well, moving on. Now, I grilled TinHifi pretty hard for blatantly copying designs from brands more famous than them, but one thing that really deserves nothing but praises is this leather carrying case. Now, I'm no leather expert, but looking at it and feeling the texture does convince me that they use some quality leather here. There's a debossed TinHifi logo on top, and opening it up reveals an open space lined with felt material, as well as a stretchy mesh for maybe storing extra tips or desiccants. There's stitching all around the case which gives it a handmade feel. The cover and the bottom are magnetized, and the case closes with a satisfying thunk. The case is truly a thing of beauty, and it's so pretty that I don't even want to use it outside. See, we need more things like this from Chinese brands. Affordable gems, rather than cheap rubbish that indulge too much in their cheapness. Now, I do understand that most people who buy earphones like this are only concerned about one thing, which is sound signature. If it sounds good and doesn't break the bank, it's already a job well done. Sometimes the earphone might sound so good subjectively that it just seems pointless, ridiculous, or even laughable to buy anything that's more expensive than $100. You know, like the earphones I've always been showing on this channel. Don't buy top-of-the-line earphones, just buy top-of-the-line killers. But I do think this is where the meaning of top-of-the-line is lost partially. We don't buy expensive earphones just for good sound. We also want them to be comfortable, durable, good-looking, or at the very least, safe to use. What's the point of buying something that sounds fantastic, but also dies fantastically quick like a firework? Do you just buy another pair when the time comes and create more e-waste for our precious planet Earth? Thoughts like these are the reasons why I find it necessary to nitpick this product as a whole, or cheap hi-fi earphones in general. Still, not everyone cares about all that, so I think now is a good time to examine what the TinHifi T4 really sounds like. But before that, let me tell you the auditioning setup I used to test this earphone. As usual, I'm using my OnQ DP-X1A as the source, ACG mode on, lock ring adjust at +2, and digital filter set to sharp. I also use Tidal for additional auditioning, as well as my PC Chord Mojo setup for tests like bass rattling and perceived dynamic range. As for the earphone, I'll be using my own MMCX cable, which is taken from my AKG N5005, and I'll use the stock fake SpinFit in medium size. I will also be comparing the T4 very heavily with the UERR. It's currently my benchmark earphone, which I've done a partial review for earlier last year. And while I fully understand the unfairness in comparing a cheap earphone to a $700 plus IEM, I do believe this is the best way for me to gauge the technical performance of the T4. I'll also make some specific comparisons with the JBC FDX1 which I reviewed a few months back. Let's start with the bass. Even though TinHifi says the frequency range starts from 10Hz, I personally cannot hear anything below 20Hz with this earphone. I can certainly do so with other IEMs like the legendary EX1000, but not this one. By ear, the volume increases gradually until around 100 Hz, after which the volume stays relatively stable all the way to 200 Hz. But what does the bass actually sound like? Having compared it with the UERR, which has really flat bass, I would say the bass on the T4 is more natural than neutral. It's only slightly north of neutral, and for all intents and purposes, nobody should complain about this IEM being a bass monster. Most people who survive the Beats era without suffering permanent ear damage should find such tuning to be genuinely pleasing, though if you do use it outside, you'll most certainly struggle to hear the bass. This is par for the course for most IEMs though, but what I do find troubling is its sub-bass. I feel like sometimes the T4 is able to produce enough of it, but other times it's almost like it's completely absent. This could be a problem with seal, which as I mentioned during physical inspection, is not consistent every time you put these into your ears. Sub-bass is nevertheless not the easiest to hear, and I also feel that it should go a little bit deeper, not by increasing volume but through the driver's ability to extend further. Occasionally, I also find the sub-bass going out a little bit too quickly compared to the UERR, leading to an overall bass response that's punchy, quick and lean. Not a technical performer, but it's easily acceptable, though to some who are already familiar with neutral or natural bass response, they will find the T4 rather boring. Still, not bad for the price. Next, let's talk about mids. In the past, I said that I'm genuinely not very picky with mids, and the reason is because I thought it's really hard for manufacturers to screw up this range. If the music and the vocals are balanced well, it's already a job well done in my mind. But after experiencing the UERR, I find that mids is probably the most difficult and time-consuming range to analyze, because there are just a lot of subtleties that can be easily missed if all you care about is how good it sounds, not how technical it sounds. Regardless, let's start with overall response. The mids from the T4 is slightly on the brighter side. This kind of tuning usually allows vocals to stand out more, but I think the T4 produces even more upper mids than something like the JVC FDX1, to the point where it might sound slightly aggressive. Relative to the UERR, which gives a much smoother presentation, I think vocals from the T4 are less pleasing as a result of the upper mids elevation. It also deters me from turning up the volume when I want to hear more of the music, because vocals or certain drums will just jut out even more. But with the UERR, I have no trouble turning up the volume because of its balanced tuning. And as much as we hate to admit, we do perceive louder to be better when it comes to music. Upon further comparison, I find that even though the upper mids boost technically gives the T4 better clarity over the UERR, when switching back to the T4, this clarity ends up sounding artificial and raw on certain soundtracks. It boosts things like s and sh that nobody wants and does nothing for the imaging and texturing of vocals. One final note regarding vocals is that I think vibrato coming from T4 is not as dynamic as the UERR. That even creates something that resembles a small rippling effect, while with the T4 the effect is flatter. This feeling carries over even when you're not listening specifically for vibrato. With the T4, vocals just tend to sound less dynamic in single volumed. By that I mean it's harder to hear how a singer adjusts the volume of their voice. They are there, but the contours are not as obvious as you might hope when listening closely. Moving to lower registers, I think the lower mids are clean but not body enough. This is not because of sound signature, but rather because of a lack of height in the soundstage, especially for things like cello that benefits from having a large imaginary headspace which makes the instrument richer and more enveloping. It can recreate the reverberation of a cello, but it's not exactly the closest to how cello actually sounds. Despite everything I just said, I think a lot of it comes down to how closely you listen to music. While it's again not a technical performer and it will never satisfy someone like me who likes to sit down in a quiet room and try to find all the nuances in a piece of music, for others who just want to grab it for a quick listen, I think they should be more than okay with the mids. Of course, the price of the T4 limits greatly where you should set the expectation, but the price this earphone is asking for, once again, I think is honestly not bad. Some might even think I'm just nitpicking, but hey, that's exactly what you and I are here for. Finally, let's talk about treble. To me, when listening to frequency sweeps from top to bottom, 20 kHz can be heard as very faint shrieks rather easily for some reason, but the first clearly audible frequency is around 16 kHz, which pops in quite subtly. I can also hear an obvious peak around 12K, and especially from 9 to 8K, which is quite unbearable. But overall, I think the treble response is similar to what you can find in most other earphones. It's just that when comparing to the FDX1, I think that while some drums are louder, other drums can be presented inadequately to the point where they are almost inaudible or can be easily overpowered by other sounds. I also think the T4's treble is a little bit slow, and so consecutive strikes on cymbals can overlap too much and be monotonous in dynamics, morphing into a loose streak of blurred splashes. This is especially problematic if you like heavy metal, power metal, death metal, anything involving fast strikes really. If you've heard the Mass Drop Plus before, the feeling is pretty much identical except the T4 is brighter. Personally, there isn't much to love regarding the treble response from the T4. It's not tuned to be airy and crisp, nor is it tuned to be authoritative and definitive. Most people might still be okay with this, but to me, it's mediocre at best. Could be a technical limitation to the driver TinHifi used in this earphone. After talking about sound signature, let's move on to soundstage and layering. Horizontal soundstage of the T4 is not all that wide, and while horizontal layering is acceptable, imaging is rather weak because sounds away from the middle are not clearly defined, and so they sound like silhouettes coming from general directions rather than as things that have a clear, defined outline. Vertical soundstage is average, and because this earphone only uses a single driver, there's no vertical layering to speak of. While I don't generally expect much out of verticality from most earphones unless custom fit is involved, horizontal soundstage is definitely something most earphones can be tuned for, mostly by driver position in the casing. On the T4, because the driver fires directly into the ear canal and possibly sits quite close to the nozzle, it makes total sense why it wouldn't be as wide sounding as something like the Sony EX1000 or to a lesser degree the AKG N5005. Those are of course a lot more expensive, but having the drivers sitting farther away or at an angle away from the ear canal should not be an expensive feature. Let's also quickly touch on dynamic range. I don't have any scientific way to measure it, so this section is only done by ear. I'm able to reach only 60 dB of dynamic range with the T4, which ranks it all the way at the bottom, comparing to my other earphones which mostly give 66 dB of dynamic range. Keep in mind that these are tested in steps of 6 dB, so in reality this is just a rough estimate from a test that's already somewhat unreliable. Only take this with a grain of salt, but supposedly a wider range should allow you to hear the faintest of sounds in the file without cranking up the volume too much. 60 dB might sound really bad when all the others are so much better in numbers, but what you can actually hear would depend a lot on your surroundings. Are you listening in a quiet room, or do you usually use your earphones in an environment where there are a lot of background noises? The quieter it is, the more dynamic range you can enjoy. How much your source hisses would also limit the experience. Even the files you listen to would have an effect too. It's probably very unlikely for sound engineers to master the files to have 60 dB swings anyway, because they understand that not everyone listens to music in isolated studios, and at the end of the day, they do want you to be able to hear every little thing in the music. Still, I think this is interesting to talk about. That's all for sound quality analysis. Next, I want to talk about ear tip compatibility. I have a bunch of major third-party tips such as Comply, Spiral Dots, many flavors of SpinFit thanks to, well, SpinFit, and even rare stuff like Sony hybrids/foam hybrids, or even the final E-type which I've yet to do a review on. Fortunately to you, the viewers, but unfortunate to me, the reviewer, the T4 apparently has exceedingly good compatibility with most of the common third-party tips out there thanks to its 5.5mm nozzle diameter. So here are the tips that I will talk about. There are SpinFit CP100 V2, 145, 155, 500, Spiral Dot Plus, Comply Isolation and Comfort series, and a first for this section, the final E-type, all except the 500 in medium size. Since I haven't talked about the stock foam tips either, I guess I'll begin with that one. Comparing to the fake SpinFit, these stock foam tips boost bass but not extension, so the bass still doesn't reach that deep. The foam tip also smooths out the upper mids a little, and cymbals sound slightly more defined, though they still sound kinda streaky. At the very least, the contour is more obvious, so if you listen closely, you can still tell apart individual strikes. Sorta. In terms of seal, the foam tips are better, but they aren't comfortable for long listens. I think TinHifi should make them more tapered and not as wide at the top. Or they could try sourcing their foam tips from somewhere else. Again, I don't think they made these. Let's actually start talking about third-party tips, beginning with the slightly updated version of the tried and true SpinFit CP100, which I'll refer to as the CP100 V2 from now on. I think it improves bass extension, which helps the T4 bring forward more of the sub-bass. The bass also sounds less reserved and has more dynamics to it. It also decays more naturally and isn't quickly brick-walled into nothing. Another nice improvement is that upper mids sound a little bit less abrasive, but somehow the tips don't actually weaken this range. Unfortunately, when testing consecutive cymbal strikes, they're still blurry and have bad contour. In this regard, the CP100 V2 is identical to the fake SpinFit. Still, I definitely prefer the real ones here because the fake ones are stiffer and not as tapered at the top. It seals better, probably because the flange actually, well, spins, and so you are more likely to get the same fit every time. The CP100 has always been a solid choice as a third-party ear tip option, and it continues to do fairly decently. If you only have the original version, expect the same sonic changes but worse comfort over long listening session because the flange is stiffer than the V2. Moving on to the CP145, it is very marginally warmer than the CP100 by giving the T4 ever so slightly more bass extension and volume, as well as more rounded mids. I would say the lower registers are more bodied, except it's more of the loose kind than the tight, punchy kind, as in there's definitely more content there, but it's not quite textured enough. Still, between this and the 100, I prefer the 145 more, but for those who are rushing to buy these after what I just said, I should tell you that these tips aren't tight on the nozzle and they come off easier than the 100. And at times you might get into awkward situations where you take out the earpiece but realize the tip is still inside your ear, and then you have to stick your fingers into it without looking like you're picking your ear. Not a fun time when somebody wants to talk to you. Now imagine that's your crush. Yikes. Next, I've got this interestingly shaped SpinFit to talk about. This is the CP155. It is the longest tip in SpinFit's catalog. Wearing the earphone with this is actually quite finicky, mostly due to the shape of the earphone. You might be tempted to insert the earphone deeper to get a better seal, but then the MMCX connector might act funny because it is so pressed against your face. Had this connection been designed to be more secure, problems like this wouldn't have happened at all. In terms of sound, overall it makes the T4 thinner sounding because lower registers are weakened. You can still get punchy bass and good decay if the earphone is worn deep, but again the fitting is so inconsistent that the bass response can change every time you use it, or even when you move your head. When the fit is right, it's basically just loud SpinFit. But if the fit is bad, the earphone sounds thin. Considering T4's original sound signature, this is not a good match at all. Moving on to the CP500, I've said in the past that this is the least SpinFit sounding tip out of their single flange tips, and I think my impression hasn't changed much when pairing with the T4. Firstly, I think the most significant change is in the lower treble. You hear more of it, and so metal sounds pretty great, but it can also get fatiguing depending on volume and the frequency at which the drums appear. Some instruments like tambourine, for instance, become louder, so in some soundtracks you might hear elements that you never really pay attention to. This is especially apparent when you have a good seal, but I think the CP145 does more of this, and the seal is more consistent and easier to get right. By that, I mean the flange of the CP500 has a relatively large surface area, so it's harder to get it to sit in the right way. The streaking effect I mentioned before is also reduced, but again the CP500 is better than the 500 in this regard. Something not everyone would be into is that I feel the bass is actually weakened, at least comparing to other SpinFits, but the brick walling effect of bass with the fake SpinFit is gone. Soundstage gets a small boost in height, which is an improvement, I think. Fitting of this ear tip might be weird to some, which can definitely lead to inconsistent sound performance between wear. Personally, I'm able to achieve good seal with the CP500 by pushing the earpiece towards the back or closer to the concha, which greatly helps with sound. I don't wear these tips all that deep into my ears, but the T4 becomes softer in volume as a result. Overall, if you can also get good seal with this ear tip, you'll be looking at some welcoming improvements to the T4 sound. Next up is the Spiral Dot Plus. It is virtually identical to the original Spiral Dot aside from the newer version being softer and made of more material, so if you have the originals, this impression should be useful to you too. The first thing I noticed when paired with the T4 is that the soundstage is taller and more open, possibly due to its huge opening. It can be inserted deeper than the CP500, so you can also go for a more intimate sound, but with deep insertion, the troubling MMCX connection might get loose and introduce audio cuts randomly. Very pesky indeed. Other improvements include better bass extension and decay over the fake SpinFit, but cymbals become very loose and streaky. Consecutive strikes become more like noises, which is terrible for metal music. Fitting with the T4 is good, but you really have to wear the earphone deep in the ears or go up a size because these tips are relatively small comparing to other third-party tips. If you want a shallow fit and slightly more open sound, you should go up a size, but then the ear tip performs like the CP500 at that point. Now let's talk about some comply tips. Beginning with the isolation series, I think it performs like the CP500 V2, but there's less treble. It's less comfy because it's more squared and wide, and it takes more time to wear because you have to squeeze it first. Soundstage is just a little bit taller, but not as noticeable as with the Spiral Dot Plus. Isolation is good because so much of the ear canal is filled by the sheer size of the tip comparing to other third-party tips of the same size. Overall, there are situations where I think the isolation series actually improves the sound, but not this time. The CP500 V2 basically does the same thing aside from soundstage, so just go with those instead. I also want to briefly touch on the Comfort series. It is the bulkiest out of all size M tips. It performs like the isolation series we looked at just now, but I think there's less bass when comparing to certain SpinFit models. Again, not something that I recommend with the T4. Finally, let's finish this section by talking about a tip that I never discussed before in reviews, the final E-type. Construction and dimensions wise, I think this is the closest we'll ever get to the classic Sony hybrid tips, at least for now. I think the E-type makes the T4 louder, but bass is actually less than CP100 V2, though the decay is still more natural than fake SpinFit. There is no change to bass extension. Treble is kinda similar to CP500, but is more detailed, especially in decay. Unfortunately, the earphone still produces streaking cymbals just like the fake SpinFit. The height of soundstage is similar to CP100 V2, so by extension, it's basically the same as with the fake SpinFit 2. Overall, my experience with final E-type is that it either improves the T4 in minor ways or does nothing to the key problems with the earphone sound, namely the streaking treble and poor bass extension. So I can't say this tip actually matches well with this earphone. To summarize my findings, my first choice of a third-party tip with the T4 is the SpinFit CP145, but the loose fit on the T4's nozzle can be a pain. Just be prepared to buy extras, I guess. Next one I recommend checking out is the CP500, but expect it to perform similarly to the CP145 except the improvements are smaller, has less consistent seal, but is tighter around the nozzle. I know this has been an exceedingly long review, but you'll just have to bear with me a little bit more because I've got a bit of stuff to rant about here aside from my final verdict of the TinHifi T4. I think at around $70 to $80 US, which is usually the price this earphone goes for, it honestly doesn't sound bad at all, objectively speaking, even for someone like me who frequently reviews mid to mid-high range IEMs. The sound signature should be genuinely likable to most people, though personally I haven't found a particular audio range this earphone excels at. Things you should expect before buying this is that it's got problems like poor bass extension, somewhat aggressive upper mids, and treble that doesn't play back all the percussion instruments clearly or have a blurred, streaking effect on consecutive cymbal strikes. It's also not an earphone of high technicality either, having average horizontal soundstage, imaging and dynamic range. Honestly though, unless you're someone like me who actually sits down and listens to music with a laser focus, you might just be able to look past most of these issues, aside from the treble thing of course. Still, subjectively speaking, I'm quite underwhelmed and excited by this earphone. When everyone and their mum hypes up earphones after earphones, calling these hi-fi cans top-of-the-line killers or budget audio king, I thought there might just be something incredible about them that I should really see for myself. But at the end, what I got was just something that's decent at best. And I'll be honest with you guys, even though I'm not known for frequent uploads, this earphone in particular is one that I had a lot of trouble reviewing, simply because I found it rather uninteresting. I recently got the JVC FW1800, and every time I tried working on this review, a question kept popping up in my brain. Why am I not reviewing that already? The sole reason I came up with was that I unboxed the T4 before the JVCs, so naturally I need to review the T4 first. Plus this earphone is very popular, so, you know. But looking beyond that, if you're not as frustrated as I am regarding this whole hi-fi heat wave, you can ignore what I said in the past minute and just buy this earphone. You need to know exactly what to look for or what music to try out in order to identify specific problems anyway. And chances are, if you understood nothing aside from what I said regarding sound signature, those problems on technicality are far beyond you. While I do think the earphone's sound quality is acceptable for the price, there are a few things about this product as a whole that rubbed me the wrong way. Firstly, the MMCX connection is so damn loose that music can cut in and out with the smallest head movement. If you pair it with a cable with no ear guide and you wear glasses, the loose connection would also make it a lot easier for the cable to just fall from your ears. So the IM style of wear this earphone goes for doesn't always work well. The stock cable does have ear guides, but I'm so sick and tired of getting shocked by it when listening to a source that's being charged, or hearing those annoying electrical noises when, again, the source is getting charged. TinHifi can't even get cable insulation right. What's up with that? There's also something I am absolutely disgusted by, and it's the fake SpinFits that come with this earphone. They damn well knew why they made them transparent and red. Speaking of plagiarizing designs, it's also not hard to see that the casing is copied from the Z1R. Chinese products have long been ridiculed for selling cheap junk that looks like the real thing but is nothing like the real thing. They really deserve all the disrespects people throw at them, and they should stop going into batshit insane hissy fits mode whenever people mock them, their country, or products from their country. You are what you did after all. So here's my honest suggestion. Make your own damn original designs and prove to the world with real, honest and genuine attempts how good you can actually be when you try really hard. Now, I know asking people from a country that takes every opportunity to suppress creative freedom to stop copying can be a tall order, but with that huge earphone industry and years of experience in audio designs, I see no reason why there shouldn't already be more hi-fi companies that are at the same status as the other major players from Japan or Western countries. They have the potential to stop being a laughing matter, and yet nobody aside from brands like Unique Melody, Aureolus and QDC have been able to step up and prove themselves, and they aren't even major recognizable players in the field. Their earphones aren't cheap either, so I think there's clearly a market niche for affordable hi-fi earphones that are well built, use completely original designs that are plagiarism free, and most importantly, be able to showcase some degree of technicality, stuff like tall and wide soundstage, good layering and imaging. Sound signature alone doesn't tell us how good an earphone is, and so hi-fi companies should pay more attention to that kind of stuff if they want to take it a step further. The same goes for general consumers like us too. Just because an earphone has decent sound signature doesn't automatically make it a top-of-the-line killer. You have to dig deeper and actually try to analyze more. It's tedious, but the more you do it, the more you realize there's actually so much more that influences the whole listening experience. And only then would you be able to tell the difference between good and truly remarkable. And finally, Can we just stop promoting lazy, low-effort copycats that blatantly steal designs? I know that's exactly what I'm doing here, having bought the earphone and reviewing it now. But if there's some form of pushback from the community against copying designs, we might actually see more creative and original designs in the hi-fi landscape. It might sound like I'm pushing some kind of agenda, but really I'm not. All I want is just for the earphone community to mature. This is going to be it for this review. If you found it useful or entertaining, don't forget to like and share the video. And if you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section. If you have this earphone, I would also love to know what you think of it. Anyway, I'll come back with yet another earphone review. Hopefully, I will see you again in the next video. Goodbye, friends.